It was really nice. It became a little chilly, but it was a lovely day.
Good afternoon, everybody. Thank you so much for coming out today. We are so excited to have this wonderful author with us. Vailes is a Washington-born author writing about a very real African-American experience, fictionalizing it into this beautiful book. I won't say too much about it because it's for her to do. I do ask that we please put our phones on silent. Everyone joining us on the live stream, you will be able to purchase the book on Eventbrite up until 10 p.m. So yes, thank you once again for coming, and please enjoy.
Hello, everybody. Hello. How are you? And thank you very much for coming. And I want to say that it's so funny because there are people here from really different parts of my life. There's Hayden's soccer team. There's my friends from long ago, my sister and husband, and from my last job, my sister-in-law's best friend from Slovakia, and parents from school in both Hayden and Grace's class, and people from the Washington Independent Review of Books, where I used to work some time ago, and thank you everyone for coming. So I wanted to thank particularly my crew here, that's Sonia Ali and Dr. Debbie Hughes, who followed me everywhere and helped so much with this book, and that's been a pleasure all along. And over also in the audience is Jane Mahaffey and her husband John, and Jane was kind enough to give a book party yesterday. We had a really great time in her backyard. It was perfect weather by the channel. So mostly I had no idea what to read, and I sort of struggled and where would I lose everyone. And Indy Moroso, the publisher, is right here sitting on the front row, and he was like, read from the very beginning. So that's exactly what I'm going to do. Thank you. And grunt if I'm reading too quickly. Meeting mostly Selma. Selma McCall was beautiful and crazy, but she didn't spend time in front of the mirror, talk to herself, have fits, or see things that weren't there. She had never had a breakdown. She suffered regular break parts. Bits of her scattered everywhere like a Humpty Dumpty who could not put herself back together again. It was memory that left her in pieces, exploding in vivid flashes of the past, followed by a destructive residue, leaving ashes of the facts, making them altogether impossible to order in any serviceable way. Memory made up the person, which was Selma's riddle. She couldn't properly remember. She was merely one of 5 personalities housed in a single woman. Only one personality was present at a time, and Selma wasn't always in possession of her mind or body, not when the others each had their turn. Her disorder had less to do with true madness than considerations of space and time. She was only available 1/5 of the time, and not by any ordinary scale or calendar, and yet Selma had somehow intuited that the key to the fractured puzzle of now must be hidden in the odd reminiscences of then. Fortunately, her responsibilities were shared, not only with her other selves, but with her family and the household staff in the American-owned mansion in the western section of Cairo, Egypt, where they all lived. Selma was the wife of the American attaché and the mother of their 3 children. Though the memories of marriage and birth did not reside within her, she was unaware of her disorder, and so were the other personalities. Still, Selma was wishful and resolute. If she could order the past, she might be able to anticipate and even invent her future. She could fix her memories and bring them back together in proper order. For Selma, memories came up like stories, and when they did, she told them to the children. After calling to them from the door, she crossed the expanse of her large bedroom, crawled back into bed, and then became undone. Fortunately, the horror of breaking apart was invisible to her children, and only temporary and mildly confusing to some, who felt as if her arms were uncomfortably folded beneath the blankets. Her legs were indescribably twisted like the broken ballerina dolls, and the pain of discombobulation had fallen unnoticed to the floor. Her disconnected hands danced from opposite sides of the large bed, Her lips moved, but the words seemed to float in from outside and float about the room. When I was little, we lived in a, Selma paused to think of a better word than shack. 3 rooms at the edge of the field, she continued. My own mama sat in the yard on top of her stump, stirring her pot like an old witch. Yellow and purple flowers stood up on their snaky stems, and when the dandelions arched and bowed in the breeze, the lawn looked like a tiny swaying choir with Easter white hair. Selma chuckled a high, sad line of TVDs. Wind-blowing grass was our orchestra, and along with the breeze went the scent of ham hocks that Mama said sweetened the pot. Mama still used great-grandmother Celsie's recipes, and they could be dangerous. Celsie's recipes messed with folks. Her food mixed up with what was already in a person, and depending upon who was eating, it might be good or bad digestion. If you were dying and wanted to, Celsie's potato tart would be the one thing you'd miss in the world. People spit her biscuit crumbs chasing their own confessions. Her pudding went down like it was the one thing that righted everything that was wrong. My mama's greens sat on the stomach like a soft blanket, covering hunger like it was cold. And Mama would have pulled up and washed down a truckload of giant collard greens, but after she cooked them, the greens barely filled her big pot. Though it was 1958, it could have been 1934, because Selma only ever talked to the children about things that had already happened. She played in the past as if it were present, and never once mentioned Cairo, Egypt, where the family currently lived. Pyramids notwithstanding, Selma's memory lived on the other side of the world in America, on the mountaintop, where she grew up. You have to feed the pig first, Mama always said. That's who, she said, ate all the greens. Some invisible pig that I told Mama should eat the kudzu and leave our greens alone. That invisible pig was my God when I was 12. Maybe before, but nothing too much ever comes to mind before I turned 12, Selma paused. On a spring day, there wasn't anything better than Mama's biscuits, greens, and ham. She'd grate in a little true cinnamon that stayed on the tongue, and pretty soon you couldn't tell if the cinnamon was in the collards, the biscuits, or the person eating. We'd sit out, eating slowly, and watching the moon come up and the stars turn on. Mama said we didn't need a man's life because we got the sky. She said some things more often when Daddy wasn't around than when he was. Little girl, today is one of your quiet months. Tomorrow it'll be non-stop noise, Mama said. Mama said I was like a tree that ran through all the seasons, all at the same time, paying no attention to the real weather. The 3 children crossed eyes at each other and giggled as they listened to their mother's strange fairy tales. These were good moments with Mama, and they would sit for hours if Mother would go on. But then her cadence changed. Mother sat up a little in the bed and began again. Only now she was talking about herself as if she were the narrator in her own childhood. First, they said that little girl never spoke a word. Then, they said she was a radio you couldn't turn off. Mother hunched one shoulder. They were always confused about us. Truthfully, townspeople didn't care too much about folks who hardly ever came to town. But they wanted explanations they weren't ever going to get for all the stuff they thought happened up in the woods. They wanted to know why all the children never came to school at the same time. They wanted to know which children belonged to which family, and they wanted to know how many children my mama really had, and how many children lived up in the woods. Mama said they were nosy and didn't need to know everything they thought they needed to know, one way or another. Mother stopped talking, the children waited, she stayed quiet. All 3 tiptoed one after the other out of the room. Today was always awkward. Selma couldn't count on herself to be in the day. Her life was more like having a big part in a stop-action film. In a scene one day, then another scene 3 days later, or 2 years down the road, in a slightly progressed future. The rest of the time she must have been traveling, though where, of course, she couldn't remember. She couldn't help being in art tours and guess she must have been born this way. When she wasn't telling childhood stories, she was the queen of not speaking until being spoken to. Communication was difficult because she never knew her lines or where she belonged. When she took the chance and said a few words, she knew that the others only pretended to understand. Selma didn't mind her life. She wasn't unhappy, merely patient. Sooner or later, everything would make sense. She'd have a party each day, and the days would flow, one behind the other, the way they were supposed to flow. She couldn't gather herself until the memories vanished. They came up like illness, temporarily derailing anything ordinary. Generally, the moments just after were not of reflection, but they were empty of time and information. Moments that would suddenly or slowly, but always inexplicably, catch a thread of the day and reel her in. Then, just as if she were a regular person waking up in a normal way, Selma got up, bathed, dressed very quickly, and hurried out of the house. Her feet clacked loudly across the marble floors. She raced out the door, and the children, always on the stake-out of their mother, followed her, careful at first not to get too close. Once, when Marilla accidentally bumped into Selma's back, she had turned and smiled oddly without uttering a single word. She looked down at her own daughter as if she were completely unrecognizable. "Do you think Mother only pretends with us?" Marilla whispered as they skipped down the street behind their mother. "Pretends? You only pretend when you want something you don't have. Mother has everything," Allie said. "Maybe she pretends she's back in the woods while she walks. Or maybe she pretends that things that happened didn't," Marilla said. "She's homesick." "Wouldn't pretending be easier in a chair?" Allie asked. "Where are they going? Where are we going?" Marilla asked. "We're following Mother. She should know where we're going." "What about getting back?" Marilla asked again. "Doesn't Mother know how to get home?" Allie replied, sighing as if the question were completely ridiculous. But somewhere in her middle, fiddling around her stomach, Allie wasn't sure of anything about their mother, and that was what needed to be fixed. Allie was going to be the one to unprove that Mother was unreliable. A while later, when Rita, the Egyptian housekeeper, found the children walking on a busy side street near the outer wall of the Cairo Museum of Egyptian Antiquities. Sand and smoke were in the air like all Cairene evenings. Sand from underfoot, smoke from the burnt husk of the corn sides. The air smelled singed and agreeable. "Your mother see you? She know you street?" Rita shouted. "We're with her," Allie said. Rita made a big show of looking around in all directions and throwing up her arms. "Well, we were," Allie said. You come, Rita." Rita grabbed their hands and turned them around. She forced them home, all the while shaving their mother in Arabic, no matter, because none of the children understood Arabic. Rita had known her share of mistresses. Why, some of them had to be mothers too, and Rita recognized the peculiarity in her new mistress as soon as she met her. She had vacancy in her eyes. She looked at Rita's hairline rather than at Rita. She'd been surprised to meet the Vailes family. They were her first brown Americans. Until now, she had assumed all Americans were white, and all the other American families had been white. But people were people, mostly problematic, good and bad. It hadn't taken long to realize that the Vailes would be the same as all the other families, except for Mrs. Vailes. Finding little American children alone on the street meant they had a careless mother. Rita took the children home and pinched them, though she called it a tickle. She didn't want them to have bad memories of Egypt, so she tried to pour something else into their heads whenever their mother did something terrible. Of course, Rita couldn't be sure that her charges understood her, but she tried. She jabbered and pinched, and then she would laugh so long and hard she'd have to sit and take deep breaths before getting up and giving the children a date-filled treat. Her new mistress could not be addressed. She didn't seem to be the type of available ears. If Umirna had anything to say, it could only be in response, after Mrs. Vailes had first addressed her. Days before catching the children on the street, Rita thought she saw Mrs. Vailes, or a mirage of her, moving so differently and purposely. Rita couldn't be sure. Mrs. Vailes on the sidewalk wore a tighter dress than she had ever seen in the house. Her hair was a loose mane and inches longer than Rita would have guessed. Much more hair coiled down her back and seemed to fit in a neat and folded knot that sat like a fixture at the base of her indoor neck. Mrs. Vailes didn't want to dress for tea with other embassy wives. There was something serene and far too certain about the woman whom Rita saw walking. She called to her once without a response and wanted to call out again, but did not. Disturbing her mistress on the street seemed too great an intrusion for such a woman. Clifton Maxwell Vailes came home from work nearly every day at the same time, and shortly afterwards the family gathered at the table for dinner. This rule was never broken unless their father worked through the dinner hour, and often he came home for dinner and went out again. Dinner was served at the same time, and everyone sat at the same place except for Mother, who moved around the table from time to time, unsure of which chair to claim. "I finally understand time," Mother whispered as she spooned her rice, but before anyone could respond, she continued, "It's the waiting between events, all the waiting moments, and then, laughing gently to herself, there ought to be events." "It's not always easy to understand everything around one," she said. Her conversation seemed to be taking place between her and someone unseen, with the children and their father thrown in the middle. And sometimes, after Mother had spoken, she might be silent again for days. Other times, Mother might go on. "Even if all you have is uncertainty," she sighed, "anything can take the day." "That's the trouble, isn't it?" she asked. Yes, interesting, really," Clifton Maxwell Vailes answered. His wife could be her own monologue and equally indecipherable to him and the children. The children remembered their mother's conversations because she so seldom had them. Mostly she told them stories, but when she did speak to them or their father at the table, sometimes they would discuss mother's words together after dinner, sifting for meaning. Mother doesn't have enough to do, explained Rilla. That's what she meant about time. No, silly, she has too much to do, that's the problem. Something comes up, and then she's got to do something else. Like what? Everything. After dinner, Mother disappeared, and the children had their father to themselves, as much as a preoccupied man could share with them. He did. Usually he read to them. He'd start by asking them about their day and how they liked their new country. They, of course, were eager to respond, and went on and on about the sights and smells of Cairo. But after a few minutes of no reaction from their father, they became quiet. Their father did not ask them to repeat themselves. He pulled out a book and read in as lively a manner as possible. Instead of children's books to his 9- and 7-year-old daughters and 5-year-old son, he read what was of interest to him, Richard Burton's books, history tainted by an outside perspective. Someone needs to say stop or go, because I never know.
So we'll take this opportunity to open it up for questions. If you have questions for Vailes Shepperd, she'd be happy to answer. Was that a hand up, Nicole? Sorry.
I have a question. So I was struck by, first I read a book a few weeks ago, I liked it very much, and I think this is wonderful. The story stays with characters and some things. And so I'm thinking about it. I wondered, among other things, why a substantial part of the early part of the book is family in Cairo. So they're foreigners, they're in a strange place. And yet, what plunged into their home life there is just their home life. And then it was interesting to me when they came home to the place that was familiar to me, which is West Washington, D.C., that they seem to be in a strange place. But what I'm interested in is the decision to let us get to know them while living in Cairo.
Actually, I think that the reason that they're set in Cairo in the beginning is Mother. And it's because she's a foreigner everywhere. And she needed to be in a place where people around her might notice her, but if they didn't understand her, it was okay. So it was easy to put her somewhere that I love, somewhere that I could describe, and somewhere where it was best if she didn't speak the language and so didn't have any responsibility. And it could have been in a bunch of places, but I like when you noticed that they were more more at home there because you're more interior in their lives than they are in D.C. Thank you.
Bring the mic closer to you.
I'm sorry.
Question to that.
With the personalities, 5 personalities of Mother, how difficult was it to write, to keep track of, because the personalities are very distinct, and even that last chapter we read, when we read that, helper in the house, you notice the rest of it, that one day the Mother was probably different personality state at that point. I imagine any book is difficult to write, but when you have 2 personalities with one character, can you talk about the difficulty of putting that together?
Sure. So the thing is that in some ways, my problem was not me writing it, but a reader understanding it. And you're absolutely right. It's like 1 woman, 5, how do you do that? So one thing I thought that was important is that they all appear in the same order. So they're all given reasons as to why and when they appear. And they're all distinct in the sense that one does one thing, another one doesn't do. And one of the scenes that I always toy with reading is because very few people interact with them and notice the differences.
Right.
So there is a scene where one woman who's been interacting with one of them for quite some time suddenly meets another after an accident, and the thing that was so easy to do in that scene is, so she, and I hate to, this isn't spoiling, but this is something that happens. So she accidentally pushes one of them in the pool and she can't swim. One of them can swim, but this particular one can't swim. And the one who pushes her in the pool thinks it's funny, so she spends a good bit of time laughing, and then she helps her out of the pool. And as soon as she gets out of the pool and dries off, she says, "Do you have any cigarettes?" And she's like, "You smoke?" Because the woman that she knew before had never had a cigarette. So they each have distinct things that they wear, that they do, and that made it easier to tell them. And they appear for particular reasons, and so that made it easy. And to be honest with you, the research about multiple personality disorder, which they don't even want to call it that now, was really fascinating. So it's, yeah.
So what was the inspiration to write this story?
You know, what I've been forgetting the whole time that I never told anyone until yesterday was that part of it is because of arsenic in old place. Does anybody remember that old movie where the two little ladies live in the house and they murder all the gentlemen that, you know, make them unhappy or something? That was kind of an original. And so that happens with the sisters who were the next generation of this family. So that was part of it. And my cousins grew up next to two women who actually had lived in Egypt in their early childhood, and their father was the attaché. And when they came back to the States, I don't think they ever readjusted. And we'd only see them as two odd women figures that would come out on their porch or something, but we never really got to know them. There was just a whisper. And so, you know, I just imagine, what would that be like? What would that, you know, that's part of the inspiration.
I'd like to ask a question.
That was me about to say, any other questions?
Oh, okay. Thank you. So I read somewhere that part of your reason for telling the story, it stems from a meditation on cruelty. And could you explain to us what that means?
So there are a couple of things that I feel like, because of slavery, and slavery isn't in the story, but you only, you know, sort of hear about it tangentially in a sense. But when they start telling you the past of the family, it goes back to slave times. And I always felt like you witness such cruelty on a day-to-day basis, you know, every day. There has to be something that travels through a society, travels through a people, travels through a family because of that. And that's the thing that attracted me to writing about them with multiple personality disorder. And what you don't know, at least from the reading just then, is that Celsi, the great grandmother, suffered from the same thing that the mother does. And so it's as if she's inherited her great grandmother's disease and some of her other talents. And multiple personality disorder is supposed to be something so cruel, so awful, so difficult for you to face happens that you create these other personalities to help you deal with the world and to help you deal with the things that you have a very difficult time dealing with. And so that's where it came. I was like, there's such cruelty in this society. And not just for the people who are victims, but also the people who practice it. And I think you don't realize that there is, what's the word I'm looking for? There's a residual effect on everybody. And you think that maybe only slaves were suffering, but slaveholders do too. And one of the things like I was writing recently, I don't know if you all read about Toni Morrison's book in the Virginia race for governor. And Terry McAuliffe was saying that he vetoed the bill that would have removed Toni Morrison's book, Beloved, out of the school system so that kids couldn't read it. The woman who fought to remove the book is because her son read it and started having nightmares. And so she was like, remove the book totally from the whole Virginia syllabus, from the system, so no one could read it. I'm like, that to me is insane. This is exactly the book that you want to use to have your children understand how terrible it was. So much so that, and I'm not being a spoiler here because they told you in the New York Times, that she killed her child rather than let her child be a slave. And, you know, she was like, oh, it gives him nightmares. And I'm like, now's the time to talk about why that was so nightmare. Not to ban the book, but to say, here's what she was writing about. And so for me, those cruelties are embedded in our society and in such a way that we probably are not thinking about it. So that was one other inspiration for telling this whole story. You don't even, you know, think about what it could do to people and how that sort of thing. And some of the characters in the book tell you how those kinds of things appear in families and what to do with them. So I hope that answered that. That was kind of long-winded. Wait.
Oh, no, it did, thank you.
Sure.
You mentioned Morrison. What are some of your other literary influences?
Well, one of the things that I wish I could do that I always think, I don't know if anybody else thinks this way when I think about Toni Morrison, because I think the most extraordinary thing that she could do aside from the writing, we all know that's extraordinary, but it was the time and place that she put the story. And I don't mean like creating the setting that they were on a farm. I mean that like in a mercy, she puts it at the exact moment in American history where an indentured servant, white, a slave, black, a family, could live in this place together. And I think it might be upstate New York where that could all take place. And there's some really sort of extraordinary things like that, I think, in her writing. I'm a big Marquez fan. I love 100 Years of Solitude. My sister and I, who's sitting right there, when we were living in Paris together, would fight about that book. Every time one put it down, I'm like, give me that! Because we were reading it at the same time. It's like, oh. And I love Mark Twain. I love, I'm one of those people that would read anything, but those people stand out for me. And I'm like, I'll take whatever trip you want to take me on. So I would be far and wide, but those three always stand out. And there are more.
What's next?
Okay, so I think this next book, and it's finished from beginning to end, but it's called, and I have the title already, and I don't know if it's going to stay like that, but right now it's called The Dr. Frankenstein in Eden. And it's about two women, one black, one white, one's a venture capitalist and one has inherited wealth, so they're both very wealthy women. They've been living in New York doing this sort of, having and doing whatever they want. And then the city starts to become very strange, very difficult to live in the city. And they decide that they're going to move to this peaceful, tiny town in North Carolina, and they're going to become farmers and rural living. They're going to grow their own food, and they're going to live happily ever after in this very Eden-like town. They're like the Robinson Crusoes, and then they find out that, things aren't as they seem. It's not so easy to try to grow your own food and feed your family, and maybe impossible because of the world we live in.
Will this book have my first Vailes Shepperd love, Monroe? Because I'm waiting for it.
Okay. All right, so now I'm going to be is this
Just yes or no, you don't have to reveal anything.
Well, I want to explain why. So yes, there's a character that she loves. His name is Monroe. Monroe is a homeless messiah living in New York, and the very wealthy venture capitalist falls in love with Monroe for reasons that you'll have to read the book to find out about. And he comes with them to that little tiny town in North Carolina. So, and actually, I could speak about him because there was a story called Monroe in an anthology a long time ago about women writing about men. And so that story appeared in that anthology. Sure. Any of you?
Hi, Joanne. Question. I'm sure you have lots of ideas regarding different subject matter on books. What catches you, or what makes you feel it casts a lens?
A book? You mean when you?
Yes, when you're writing.
When I'm writing, or when I'm picking some other book?
When you're writing.
Oh. I mean, for anybody who writes, the most lovely thing is to be sitting there with your computer, or your used to be a number 2 pencil on a spiral notebook, and getting it right. Like somehow the words on the page, jive, and you get exactly what you want. And the funny thing is, everybody should write, because one of the things that happens is it pulls so much out of your mind, so much that you think you don't know, that you think you forgot. If you get into that fluid state where you're writing and it just is happening, that's when you feel like, something about this is right. And you hope that you're right.
During the pandemic, there's been, I think, somewhat of an awakening about mental illness in general, and how it is so broadly experienced in our society. Why did you focus on multiple personality disorder as opposed to, kind of the broader topic of mental illness in the communities?
You know, I think for me, you know, choosing multiple personality gave me more room. You know, there was more things that I could include in a character. Because that's the other thing. If I'm writing about someone and then she does something very odd, I have to explain that in the text for the reader to understand. With different personalities, I can give each one of them something that I want to write about, and so it helps in that sense. And I have to tell you that. So I don't know if you all know who Alice Randall is, but she's the writer of The Wind Done Gone, and you know she wrote that retelling of Gone with the Wind and a few other books. And she was, some of us in this room that are connected to GDS, Alice Randall was a GDS student, and so I think she's, you know, other people that went to GDS will know her. She's probably more well known as a writer. And she was one of the people, and she's at Vanderbilt now as a professor, and I think she has another book that came out too. And I sent it to her, and she was like, oh, you're doing this all wrong. You should have sent this to me before you put it out in the world, because the mental illness thing, she goes, there's a whole volume, which I didn't know, of people writing about, in fiction, of writing about people that are dealing with those sort of illnesses, and that it was very, you know, growing and pretty important now, and that's one of the things that you should consider. And I just didn't know, so I was ignorant of that. But she was like, it is a growing more now. So,
Well, I might kind of explore some of the genre more, because so many people are dealing with family members who have mental illness, and so it's so broad, and so many people are trying to figure out how to deal with it. So,
yeah, no, thank you. And I think that that pandemic has exacerbated so many things like that. It's true. So, sure. Seriously.
So how long did it take you to write the book?
You know, that's a difficult question, because for one thing, I thought I would just be finished from beginning to end like a few years ago. But then in working with a publisher and an editor, and then you got to do some more, so then that stretches that time out a little bit longer. You know, I can't even answer from beginning to end. A couple of years, 2.5 years, something like that. Sure.
Just a follow-up question. Where did you find the time to do the most productive? You did the research and then the writing. You have to have a job, I understand. You do writing at night, your off time, or describe that process.
Sure. I'm a morning person, and I did have a job, but I'm one of those people, unfortunately, who wakes up at the crack of dawn. I'm like, am I a farmer's daughter? Because somehow naturally I get up at 5 or more, and I write. And for me, the morning is the easiest time to do it. So, yeah, it is. And for me, the other thing that I always did, I stop on inspiration. So a lot of your time when you're trying to write, if you don't know what you're going to write, that's time wasted. So for me, like the day before, I know what's coming next. It's easy for me to stop then, because in the next morning I can get right to that point and go on, and it actually helps me. It helps.
You took notes as it came into your mind during the course of the day, or were you using a computer, or were you using pen and paper?
Sometimes pen and paper, like Post-it notes, sometimes on the computer, sometimes nowadays on your phone. And the other thing that I'm like many of the characters in this book, I'm a walker, and that's when they really start talking. And so you're like, well, you sometimes, and you know, I didn't used to ever think I'd forget anything. Now I'm a little wary of my own mind, so I'm like, I better write this, because if I forget it, I'll be angry. And sometimes it'll come back to you in the process. Sometimes I'm glad I've written it down. So, thank you. Jane?
He asked my question.
Oh, he did?
It's one thing that you like to write.
Well, I'll steal her time. I'm interested in the degree to which you discovered, let me put it this way, how often did your characters suddenly do something that surprised you?
All the time.
Okay.
I mean, just because, you know, you have something in mind that you want to do, and the character makes better sense of it than you do. You know, that's what happens to me. I'm not, you know, I like to liken it to being like Mark Twain, because that used to happen to him all the time. He at least that's what he said, because I always thought that was a failure on my part in the beginning. Like I had the story set in my mind this way. As I wrote it, it would never go in that direction. And then I was like, well, what am I going to do except keep writing and see if it works? So that they definitely surprised. And I also think that's part of the media of it too, which is nice.
Did you ever experience writer's block
writing to me is a joyful thing, and the only time that I ever felt like I'd never write again was when my oldest brother died. That's when I didn't want to. Otherwise, not really. No. I mean, that, it's the other thing about me, and I know this is going to sound really strange, but I've never had any trouble imagining something. So I was never going to be like a hallucinogenic drug user, because I was like, that would take me somewhere I'd never get back from. So, there's always some sort of, give me a word, I'm going to imagine something. So, no, not in that sense.
Any other questions from the audience?
We had a pretty rich conversation, I think.
Awesome. Thank you so much.
If you have a book that you would like someone, she'd be happy to do it. Yes, you can do that also. Oh, no.
We're going to have her sign up here, so you can do a quick little purchase back here. Come up here, and we can just do that as efficiently as possible. Thank you all so much for joining us here at Busboys and Poets.